Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Melinda Herring. I'm the editor of Ukraine Alert blog here at the Atlantic Council, and we're delighted to see so many people here today to discuss Ukraine's parliamentary elections, which were last Sunday. I'm joined by three of the best experts on Ukraine here in Washington. I'll start all the way on my left, Dr. Anders Oslin. In the middle, Ambassador John Herbst, and to my left, Adrian Kernitsky. Now let's jump into the discussion. As you all know, Servant of the People did tremendously well last Sunday, and they now have it looks like they're going to have a parliamentary majority. So I want to start with Adrian, who's been watching Ukraine forever and ever. Adrian, is Ukraine headed in the right or wrong direction, and why?
It looks from the preliminary inclinations of, it all depends on one person. It really doesn't depend on the parliament at the moment. It depends on Volodymyr Zelenskyy, his instincts, and his core beliefs. The most interesting thing about Mr. Zelenskyy is that a year ago he didn't have a broad range of core political beliefs. At the moment he seems to be strongly identified with, I would say, the liberal economic model, with trying to clean up the country, with the consistency of the earlier firm positions vis-a-vis Russia. They've announced, for example, the renewal of the defense budget at 5%, a desire to reform the courts. So I think in programmatic terms, I'm optimistic simply because he is wedded to these ideas. The real question is, how steady will his individual commitment to ideas that he has come to only very recently in his life, whether we can necessarily count on this to be a consistent policy through the course of his administration.
That sounds like a cautious yes, Adrian. Anders, how about you?
Well, I think that this is a tremendous opportunity. What we have seen is really a clean out of the old elite. 75% plus of parliamentarians are now new, and we will see something completely new come for. And the average age of the parliamentarians has fallen from 48 to 41. So this is a young crowd dominated by people 35 to 40 years of age. It's a new generation that has come to the fore. They don't know much about politics as yet, but they know pretty well what is wrong with Ukraine. And the question is if they can put it right.
Great. John, and where are you on this question?
We are at another watershed in Ukraine's history. Maybe this time the watershed will be significant. Actually, to be fair, the one in 2014 was significant. Now it's a question whether they can build on it. I don't think there's any question that Zelenskyy has the electoral authority to make the changes that his campaign was premised on. Ukraine is never as good as it seems or as bad as it seems. So I suspect it's going to be a slow process, but we're in a position for him to move if he chooses to move.
And of the big electoral promises that Zelenskyy made, which do you think he'll be able to deliver on, John?
I think he could choose almost any of two or three, which could be of great importance. For example, he could truly clean out the Procurator General's office. In ways that establish it as a model of jurisprudence and not politics. He could begin a similar process, although be harder, with the courts. He could finally take the last steps on the gas reform that was so important under President Poroshenko. And there are other issues where Anders can go in greater depth than I can.
Of course. Anders, tell us a little bit more about the economy. It's one of the big issues that Zelenskyy campaigned on, and he's pledging that he wants to turn things around. He's saying all the right things. When he talks to the business community is ecstatic to hear that there's a president who wants to cut red tape. Can he deliver? Can he take the GDP from 3.25 to 7 or 8, like you've been saying Ukraine needs to be at?
Yeah, if you take the simple problem is that investment is too low. So investment ratio is about 20% of GDP. It should be 30% of GDP. How do you get there? 4% of GDP is the net capital outflow from Ukraine each year because Ukrainians sensibly dare not keep the money in Ukrainian banks or in the Ukrainian economy. because of massive corporate raiding. About 1,000 companies each year are stolen by law enforcement. This is the main fundamental problem. That's why Ukrainians don't keep the money in the economy. And in the same way, foreign direct investment is about 1% of GDP each year. In real terms, it should be 5% at least. Then we're up with 8% of GDP more in investment in the economy, and then we get 7% growth. And how do we get there? John already mentioned clean out the Prosecutor General's office, which has, as far as we know, no Prosecutor General can be accused in Ukraine's independent history, can be accused of not having been corrupt. And the second is the security services. The frightful Department K, responsible for economic crime, I mean it in that fashion, it has 8,000 officers. These people should be sacked. And these are the two big steps that need to be done. But then you wonder, how do you get there? Abolish the immunity of the parliamentarians. If you're a businessman in Ukraine and are really crooked, then you want to be a parliamentarian. So it was wonderful to see all these awful crooked businessmen now being kicked out of the parliament, which means that they no longer have immunity. They can be sued and they can be prosecuted. So I think these are what I would like to see Zelenskyy doing the first day of parliament is to do away with parliamentary immunity.
For sure, for sure. Adrian, is SBU reform possible? Do you think that Zelenskyy is going to take it seriously to finally get rid of this unit that cracks down on economic crimes?
It's certainly possible. I think a little bit of a preamble. In its counterintelligence work focused on external threats as well as fifth columns and so on, the SBU, I think, and its work on the front in terms of intelligence and operations behind enemy lines, although on Ukrainian territory, the SBU is, I would say, a positive institution. The Department of Economic Crimes is a giant monster that clearly could easily be shed or reconfigured. If you want to look at a basis of comparison, the Security Service of Ukraine has 30,000 employees, whereas MI5, a comparable institution, admittedly not in a country at war, has 4,000 employees. The budget of the Polish Agency of Social Security, Internal Security, is about $150 million a year. The Ukrainian budget for this year is budgeted at a little under $400 million for a country where average wages and so on are. So there's a lot that could be done in a simple way that would actually have budgetary consequences, but also some benefit. At the same time, there needs to be some kind of an institution that monitors this. I mean, there's a website that many of you may know called opendataBot.ua, which has a running list from open sources of various data concerning corruption and so on. And the number of raids in the last 7 years, corporate raids and takeovers against Ukrainian companies or other companies, is 3,242 raider takeovers. This kind of a record is clearly something that the government could move quickly if it wanted to change.
I should add that Zelenskyy last week, one of his first decrees last Monday was against corporate raiding.
Yeah. John, you wanted to jump in, please?
I should have mentioned when you asked me the question first, the two appointments Zelenskyy has made could point to serious progress on major reform issues. One is Ivar Zabramovich's to head Ukroboronprom, which is a serious problem of the whole lack of transparency and corruption in that sector. And also Nefedyev to run customs, another source of great corruption.
Can I make one more point? And that is that in the previous administration, some of the economic reform changes were extremely painful economically, especially energy pricing reform and such. There are maybe some lower hanging fruit if Nefyodov succeeds in teasing out revenues from the customs service. If, for example, there is a bit more pressure through the tax authorities to reduce the off the books economy. If there is, for example, a return to a settlement of the Ukrainian government's claims against Mr. Kolomoisky, there are a number, and if there is this a negotiated effort or administrative effort to reduce rents, as we've seen in the case of Rotterdam Plus, all those kinds of things show places where the budget could be squeezed to provide some serious additional revenue without hitting the pocketbooks of, say, ordinary Ukraine.
For sure. Let's get back to the elections for a minute. There's a couple more questions on that, and I know that our audience will want to ask them as well. So we have a parliament with 5 parties in it, and one party that some expected did not make it. Holos did not do as well as many had predicted. Anders just said that the age declined. We see more women in parliament. What surprised you? Did anything surprise you from the results of the elections, Anders?
Well, the specific surprise is that the servant of the people did so well in the single-man constituencies, because these have typically been bought by crooked businessmen. And now servant of the people did even better in the one-man constituencies than they did in the proportional part. If I remember rightly, 130 out of 199 deputies. So this means that the people we don't want to see in parliament, by and large, are not there, apart from in the opposition platform, which did exactly as well as expected.
Adrian?
Well, the biggest surprises are, I think it was the size of the majority was not to be predicted precisely because of what Anders had suggested, but I think that the biggest shock to the system is that 76% of people have no legislative experience, and if you bore down even further, certainly in the servant of the people list, there are people with very little political or even civic engagement. There is I would say a small, very impressive minority of deputies in that list that can carry the burdens of pushing forward legislative ideas and so on. And as probably this audience knows, as we meet now, there is a training operation going on in a spa with mineral bath spa in Truskavets in western Ukraine, where the 254 deputies, or most of them, are getting basic training. But it's a kind of a unique phenomenon, because remember, by comparison, when we had the Gingrich Revolution in 1994, with a huge change from one party to another in a midterm election, there were about something like 50 new legislators. The rest of the people had some degree of experience. Now, if you bore down a little further into the servant category, you will find, there are some journalists, who've covered policy, there are some people who are deputy aides to, or assistants to parliamentarians, but really this is a very raw group of people, which is what brings me back to the original theme. It really is everything is going to be dominated from the presidential office, and everything in the end is going to be dominated by the judgments and evolving views of Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
They may be at a spa, but it is a serious economics camp that Kiev's...
They're in the most luxurious hotels, and not that that's saying very much, but they're the most luxurious spas in that spa community.
Okay, fine.
No, it's
Kiev School...
They're working all day, but they're...
Kiev School of Economics, though, is running it, and they're a serious operation. John, what surprised you about the elections, if anything?
I wouldn't say anything surprised me except the extent of servant of the people's victory. But I think the most important thing about the election is the fact that the servant of the people now is taking significant votes from the East and the South. And so the results achieved by the opposition bloc for Life Party, as Adrian said, was as expected. But point of fact, they no longer quite represent that part of Ukraine. And the fact that that part of Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for a party which is basically, although not unambiguously and not directly endorsed a westward-looking foreign policy is very, very significant for Ukraine's
There is
future.
one caveat to that, and the interesting part of the geography is it's true, but the closer you get to the combat zone, the more pro-Russian the sentiment on the Ukrainian side, which is really a surprise to me.
Adrian, talk to me a little bit more about Servant of the People. Some people are saying it's not a real political party. There's many groups within it. Who will be the important leader in these groups, and how can you keep a political party like that functional?
Well, I think that the party will function to the degree that Zelensky's popularity remains strong. And if it remains strong for a protracted period of time, I think the party will shape its identity and people will begin to be more deeply connected to a set of ideas. It's almost inevitable that if you're within a system and then you're basically buying into the system. The danger would be that if his popularity were to take a tumble, either quickly or precipitously, that this kind of free-floating group of people without any deep connections to politics, and frankly, without any deep connections to Volodymyr Zelenskyy, people who kind of, I wouldn't say opportunistically, but who kind of went all in and on a of an act of faith, of political faith, to advance their careers and to advance their ideas. I think it'll be much harder to hold that group together, which is why I think it's extremely important for him to have early successes. It's really extremely important to build a political party, because again, I would say that the main characteristic is we still don't have ideological parties. The party has an ideology, but it is not deeply embedded in I think there are people in the administration that are committed liberals. There are appointees that are committed free market voices. I mean liberal in the economic sense, not in any other. And I think that you need a process by which, not by a one-week training camp, but by some kind of occultation or acculturation into this process.
For sure. Did either of you want to jump in on Servant of the People? No? Okay. So another thing that's remarkable about this election is that I think all of the Euro optimists -2 are no longer in the parliament. So a lot of the faces that we're familiar with, Sergei Leshchenko, Svetlana Zalishuk, Mustafa Naim, Hannah Hopko, none of these people are in the new parliament. Who are going to be the new reformers? Can you give us a few names that we should be watching? Anders? John?
Well, I mean, we have seen now last week 4 people were invited to be interviewed by the president and his chief of staff for becoming prime minister. Ivaras Abramovicius, the former minister of economy that John already mentioned, Alexander Daniliuk, who's now a national security advisor, and Vladislav Rashkovan, who's the executive director, alternative executive director for Ukraine at the IMF, who previously was deputy head of a national bank. Whom do I forget? So, and Andrei Kobolyev, the head of Naftagaz. So these are the kind of people that we are looking at, and typically. Needless to say, Zelensky looks upon people of approximately his own age. All these people are around 40 years of age, and they are well educated. Of course, Ukraine now has so many more well educated people, and from the last 5 years, a lot of them has serious executive experience in government or in enterprises. So I think that we will see that they will come out very well qualified, and essentially everybody in the group speaks English.
And then there's a 6th candidate as well. A 6th name has emerged to be the prime minister, Alexei Honcharuk. And if you believe the rumors, he's supposedly the favored candidate, but who knows? So it looks like Zelensky may choose a technocratic prime minister. That's the way it looks right now, right?
Yeah, and what Adrian said here before, it seems that they are very much looking for their people who have joined them reasonably early. And we are now seeing both the main candidate for Prime Minister, Honcharuk, and the candidate for becoming Prosecutor General. They are working as deputy chiefs of the presidential administration. So you need to come to Zelensky early in order to get a position, it seems. And naturally, being in this situation, we are very reluctant to trust strangers who are just coming to them. So the earlier they came, the more likely they are to get high positions. But it's extremely open as yet.
But I mean, this is obviously a process that will change over time as the parliament and the new team in the parliament develops its own competencies and so on. But I think we need to look at obviously the presidential office and then the government that takes shape as the main driver of legislation, political agendas, and so on. It's been pretty similar to the model that existed under Poroshenko, minus one caveat, and that is that there you had to balance between two partners in the governing coalition, and here there is no place where balancing is required.
So if I understand what you're saying, it's kind of a useless exercise to make sort of lists of these are the 10 reformers to watch in Parliament. It's basically we should be studying Servant of the People's Party list.
I think we should be studying what happens in the government appointments and in the office of the president.
Okay.
And over time, I think, the system will create its own leaders inside the parliamentary structures. They may not necessarily be the people that are at the top of the list. There may be some talent buried further on. Again, when you see there are people in the top of the list. There is a gentleman named David Arachamia who's become fairly influential. He was fourth. He is a businessman. He came out of he was involved in voluntary assistance to the to the counterterrorism operations and to the Ukrainian volunteer and other forces, but he's now emerged as an additional important voice. He's been named as the Secretary of the National Investment Council, a fairly important position, and he seems to be one of those kinds of people. Certainly, if Mr. Razumkov, the very young potential Speaker of the Parliament, becomes Speaker of the Parliament, he will become an influential voice. But typically, the head of the Parliament does not play that kind of a role of leadership inside the party faction. He operates on a different level. Of course, this is a different model because the parliamentary faction is, in a sense, the only game in town. So he may emerge as a kind of a person who shapes beliefs and helps shape an identity in addition to the president inside the parliament. But I think it's still too early to say.
Okay, great. That's a great answer. John, how influential is Chief of Staff Andrei Bogdan?
The assumption is, and I say assumption because it's a very early period, that he's very influential. Of course, his appointment has raised a lot of concern in reform circles in Ukraine and abroad. I know that President Zelenskyy has said he's the one who's determining policy. He's relying on Bogdan because he's obviously and notable, publicly a very effective individual. But there are question marks, and this needs to be watched.
Anders or Adrian, do you have anything more to say about Bogdan?
It is believed, but I have no way of knowing, that he is a person practiced in transactional politics. That's not a code word for corruption. It is a code word for knowing how a political game is played, how you balance interests, how you move things forward, how you have informal understandings, not all of them of a illicit nature, but of a practical nature, of finding ways to get, say, business media to be helpful in messaging and that sort of thing. So I think he's extremely valuable in that sense, and I think it's very clear that if there is an inexperienced person in the top position of Prime Minister, Mr. Bogdan will have substantial influence over the operations of the government alongside the president.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I know everyone here is dying to know about Ihor Kolomoisky. I know you're going to have to do some speculation, but how much influence does he have in the new parliament and with the new presidential administration? No one wants to take this.
Roughly 30 people in some ways affiliated with him in the Servant of the People.
Okay.
I think some of them are from Ukrop, who kind of cropped up in the list, and there are about 11 from 1+1, 11 journalists from 1+1. It's not necessarily clear that all of them are fiercely loyal to Mr. Kolomoisky, but it is an unusually large presence inside that parliamentary group.
I think that's right, and I think it would be unusual if that were not the case. It would just fly completely in the face of 30 years of Ukrainian history. Having said that, we don't know to what extent he'll be able to truly exercise control, and that depends in part upon, again, President Zelenskyy. President Zelenskyy has a unique authority right now to push hard. Whether he does or not is a question, but we need something to understand.
I'm not particularly afraid of Igor Kolomoisky. To me, he's very much like Boris Berezovsky, who, when Putin came into power, Berezovsky had to tell everybody that it was he who selected Putin, and therefore Berezovsky told everybody that he was really the most important. Somehow Putin didn't like that. And within a year, Berezovsky was out of the country. I suspect something similar will happen with Kolomoisky, thereby not suggesting in any way that Zelenskyy is similar to Putin, but that Kolomoisky is very similar to Berezovsky. If you make time and time again interviews that are 40 pages long, when you are supposed to be important, something is wrong. So Kolomoisky can't keep quiet about how important he is. And he gave an interview to the Financial Times, was it a month ago or so, which took down the hryvnia in one day by 3%. Because he argued in favor of default, and he of course wants to have a Privatbank back. He won't get Privatbank back. And then instead he says, but I could take $2 billion. This is a man who has stolen $5.5 billion of depositors' money in Privatbank. You know, the best way of stealing money from a bank is to own a bank, because then you give all the loans to yourself. That's exactly what Kolomoisky and his partner Bagalyubov did, and then they take the money out of the country and it disappears through a lot of shell companies in Cyprus. So it's so obvious. Everybody who's anybody has told Zelenskyy, you must not allow Kolomoisky to get Privatbank back, because that will cut all relations to the West. So that will not happen. So I think that Kolomoisky will get, with any new prosecutor general, the treatment that he should get from a prosecutor general.
I think you're right about the analogy with Kolomoisky, and maybe even with the long-term outcome. But I would say that the difference with Kolomoisky is probably a couple zeros at the end of the assets that he controls currently, and also the claims he has against the Ukrainian state, legitimate and illegitimate, as well as the accumulated, I'm told, with interest. He now owes over $8 billion from the time that the deal he had made a deal to restore $5.5 billion of funds into the capital of Privatbank. The unpredictability of Ukrainian courts and the uncertainty of what is going on around the Kiev District Administrative Court, which has produced very many complex and problematic decisions, suggests to me that Kolomoisky is not completely out of the game, because I don't think this government and this administration yet has cleaned up the courts in a way that they become predictable. So he is this sword of Damocles dangling over the economy, and he does, I'm told, have a serious claim about $2 billion worth of gas that was appropriated from him almost a decade ago, and his claim against Ukraine on that is strong. A settlement with him would be very beneficial to the country, just a legitimate settlement, meaning he has assets that he could bring to the table. He has assets in Ukraine and a claim against Ukraine, which could be used against this debt. He has returned to Ukraine from Israel, assuming that that gives him a higher level of protection against potentially foreign inquiries into his economic practices. And as I understand it, Mr. Bohlyubov has returned to Ukraine and may be seeking Ukrainian citizenship. So that either means that they're completely miscalculating, or they have an exaggerated sense of their zone of comfort. So again, I'm not sure what will happen, but I have heard from some Ukrainian officials that they would be interested in a fair settlement of the differences of the parties on a range of these issues. And if they did have that kind of settlement, it would actually contribute a flow of resources into the Ukrainian economy and a removal of a whole range of uncertainties that would be beneficial to the state and its plotting of the future. So if Ukraine could restore a few $1 billion of the billions that are alleged to have been illicitly used for related party, dodgy related party lending by Mr. Kolomoisky's companies, I think that would be a quick win for the administration.
John, you wanted to say something?
Oh, no, I'm good on that.
You're good? Okay. So we talked about Kolomoisky. What about the other oligarchs? How much influence, Adrian, do they have in the new parliament?
Very little. The one, I guess the most influential oligarch, if you call him an oligarch, is Viktor Medvedchuk, because he has substantially bolstered his positions. Of course, he's a kind of a virtual oligarch, because a lot of his oligarchy depends on the capacity to make money with the help of President Putin and of Russia. And then I think Mr. Firtash's group still has a residual group in the parliament. And as I said, Mr. Kolomoisky with 30. With the breakup of the old opposition bloc into Mr. Akhmetov's and the Medvedchuk Firtash group into these two separate directions, Mr. Akhmetov has basically disappeared as a major force. The victories by unaffiliated servant of the people candidates with very little experience usually happened, as Anders was pointing out, over people who were either backed by individual businessmen in local constituencies in their own backyards to promote their local interests, or were outrightly themselves business operators, and very many of those names have been dismissed. So I don't know if anyone has done a direct mapping of the previous parliament, but if we were sort of saying that more than half of the previous parliament had strong patronage relationships with oligarchic interests, or were themselves in the financial game in a substantial way, I'm guessing this parliament is probably a quarter of that or less. So 10% of the parliament may have those kinds of associations.
So if we have any political science students here, we need you to get on that question, please. That would be extremely helpful. I keep hearing all three of you saying the same sentence over and over again, or the same clause. It depends on President Zelenskyy. It depends on President Zelenskyy. So you guys have all watched Ukraine for many years. You know the history well. What makes him tick? What should we be watching to sort of understand him? He gave an interview to Novo Vremya behind the wheel of his Tesla, and he said he wants to make history. Do you believe him? Is he motivated by this deep desire of, he's already famous, he already has lots of money, he seems to have a happy family life. What makes him tick, Adrian, John, Anders?
All right, I'll take a stab. Certainly he's been a very successful comic, which is not an easy thing to be, and a successful businessman. I met him in February before he was really briefed on the politics and the economics of being the president of Ukraine. But he struck me as a serious guy, and he obviously ran a brilliant campaign, which he won by an extraordinary margin. Those who met him 6 weeks after I did said he'd become a lot smarter on the issues he'll confront as president. And we've seen his deftness in dealing, for example, with Putin's passport provocation when he was president-elect. We've also seen a certain boldness in his policy making. First, when he offered the Kremlin a certain amount of concessions on the war. First, he talked about 2 referenda, which in theory showed a softer approach towards Moscow than Poroshenko's, but he received nothing in exchange from the Kremlin. He also talked about easing of border crossings in Luhansk, something that Poroshenko refused to do. Again, no response from Moscow, because I think Putin was put off by the fact that when Putin provoked him on passports, Zelensky's clever response made Putin shut up and look foolish internationally, something which Putin was not used to. And then, having headed in this direction initially, they seized the Russian oil tanker last week, a rather bold move. And to hedge their exposure, they then released the crew while keeping the tanker. A bold move, and it's unclear how this will follow. If I had to offer a bottom line assessment, a few weeks into his presidency, I think he means it when he says he wants to be an historic figure. I think he will try to make a serious difference on corruption while protecting the country's security. But he'll also have to cut deals. I think he's probably already cut deals. He's a neophyte, and we don't know how neophytes do until they actually do something. And whether he will have the ability to do what he wants to do is a question. But I think he will certainly try.
Anders?
Well, so far it seems to me that the best way of understanding Zelensky is really to watch A Servant of the People. I recommend everybody to watch it. It's available on Netflix with English subtitles. It's a wonderful show, and I think that it tells you more about Zelensky than anything you can hope for. There are 3 oligarchs who are manipulating everything. Zelensky puts them all into prison. The oligarchs take revenge by having him impeached, buying the whole parliament, and putting him into prison. And then he gets re-elected from prison after he has been impeached. So I think that what strikes me of his actions so far is that he has been quite determined, that he has acted quite hard. He has taken his time on some decisions. We see that he has interviewed a lot of people, for example, for Minister of Defense, and then wasn't satisfied with any, so therefore he did not make a decision. While we're also seeing that he has sacked, 20 out of 24 regional governors, as it should be done, and demands very firmly that the bad officials should be sacked. So this is really what you need to do in the current situation in Ukraine. So decisive and determined, but at the same time deliberate in his decision making is what I see so far.
I think that the fundamental challenge for him is to identify people of experience that he can trust. He built a campaign on a model that no one is trustworthy. He's pretty much said that a couple of weeks ago, that apart from my inner circle, there aren't people that I'm willing to trust. The system is so dirty and bleak. But I think that's like the television series, a caricature of the country. The country has a lot of able public servants, potential public servants, and people with administrative experience. And I think he needs to develop the capacity to identify who those are and to develop a degree of trust, because with the ambitions of trying to change history, I think you have to change history with people of substantial substance who can carry the weight and the burden of the big hopes and intentions that he has, and more importantly, the hopes that the Ukrainian people have invested in him. And I think it's going to be a test of how the government is shaped, and the more you look to control everything from the inside, the harder it will be to recruit people of talent and ability and of experience who will want to have some degree of delegation of power. I don't want to get too involved in American politics, but it is a challenge when you have the chief executive pulling you back or relying on a informal group of relatively unsystemic people at the upper reaches of power. And I hope that the learning curve already is steep in terms of agendas and issues. I hope that the learning curve about the adequacy of personnel will be equally steep.
I have one last question for you, and you have to forgive me. I have to ask this question. So the day that Zelenskyy became president, a photo came out of Zelenskyy walking out of Bankova surrounded by a team of men. Is he going to appoint any women as ministers? Do you think he just doesn't have a pulse or doesn't care about that issue? Or what do you think? I know I'm asking you to sort of read his mind, but...
It is kind of like, it's like Monty Python's Flying Circus. He was a guy, his TV show is a guy thing. It's all of a guy thing. And I'm afraid that since he relies on this kind of a little cohort, I don't think he's gone beyond it. But to his credit, there is a very large number of women who have been elected on his list,
True.
Fewer on the party list and more at these grassroots majoritarian, which is also fascinating. That actually the process, whatever process it was, opened the door to a large number of women. It's like I think 21% of the Ukrainian parliament will be women as opposed to 12.5%, and I think it's a far larger proportion even in the servant of the people and in the overall parliament, with the retrogrades being the opposition platform and a few of the other, but actually President Poroshenko's party, Holo's party, and Zelensky's party were the most forward. And I think that in this process, over a year and a half, as people develop, the women in the parliament develop a skill set and a presence, they may not make it in the first round, but they might make it in the, when there is a rotation or when there are shifts in leadership or adjustments. So I hope that he will have in mind, some gender sensitivity as well as sensitivity to qualifications. Both can come hand in hand. But unfortunately, the dynamic seems to be that it's kind of a guy thing, and it seems to be also there's this cohort of his coevals, his contemporaries, who go to the beach together,
Yeah.
who hang out together, who go to the gym together, and then who sit in the presidential administration together.
I'd like to see his wife take a bigger role as well. She's given a couple of very interesting interviews. She's a screenwriter, and she comes across as intelligent, modest, low-key, but also knows the names of journalists and of human rights activists. So let's hope that she takes a bigger role in the administration.
Yeah, I think that your question is very much to the point. So if you look up on all the photos with Zelenskyy, say that it's 20 men and his wife. That's what they normally look like. And in the current government, there are 4 women. The 3 of them are definitely out. And the Minister of Education and the Minister of Healthcare, they are definitely out, and the discussion is that they will be replaced by men. And then you have Deputy Prime Minister for European Affairs, in all probability will be a man. There are also the Minister of Finance, Oksana Markarova, who's very much a civil servant, is likely to stay on. They are said to like her, and she has a very strong reputation. And since she holds a very important place where Zelenskyy does not seem to want to change anything, but rather maintain it. So my guess is that we will see a government with 1 or 2 women. You won't be happy about that.
The other one might be then Zarkal, who's been mentioned as either the foreign policy advisor at Bankova or as foreign minister, if Pristeko is not foreign minister.
Okay. Well, that's definitely a space to watch. Now it's your turn to come in. So please raise your hand, and I'm going to call on you. Please tell us your name, your affiliation, and please ask a question. Please don't give speeches or statements. I'm going to start with this gentleman right here, please.
Hi, Bill Hill from the Kennan Institute. I'd like to ask you to address foreign policy. Specifically, what do you think that Zelenskyy's options are and possible approach to the war in Donbass and relations with Russia?
Well, I think that Zelenskyy came in with a different approach than Poroshenko, and we saw that in those 3 items that I mentioned earlier. One talking about a referendum on relations with Russia, a referendum on whether or not Ukraine should join NATO, and then also a willingness to ease up on transit along the line of contact in Luhansk. But again, none of those things elicited a positive response from Moscow. We saw the Putin provocation, which Zelensky parried brilliantly. And people who have joined Zelensky's team, who were not part of the inner circle, say, a year ago, have told me that they see him listening and learning and moving in a direction very similar to the policy that has been established over the past several years. So I think that's what we see happening. One, because it may suit Ukraine at this point in time, but two, because there's been no response when Zelensky did offer a hand. And again, he was offered a very bad move in that passport provocation from Putin. I've said this consistently for the last 5 years, and I'm not sure I'm in a majority, but I think that Ukraine, or put another way, the president of Ukraine is in an easier position than the president of Russia regarding the war in Donbass. Because by and large, although Ukraine is obviously the weaker party, the people of Ukraine understand that they are subject to Kremlin aggression. They are behind their country retaining its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. Whereas the people of Russia are told by their leader that there's no Russian war in Ukraine, it's just some Russian volunteers, when we know that's nonsense. And that's why Putin has to hide his casualties. We also know that the people of Russia are unhappy with their own economic circumstances, which some of them have connected with the war in Donbass, and even with the seizure of Crimea, which is no longer the wonderful popular issue for Putin that it was in 2014 and even 2015. So my sense is that as long as the West continues to support Ukraine no less than it is today, and I'd of course like to see that support grow, I think that ultimately the Kremlin's going to have to leave Donbass, and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity will be reconfirmed.
Yeah, please.
So in terms of how I see the dynamic, I regard President Putin's actions externally as a means of consolidating, maintaining power and mobilization inside Russia. And to the extent that when the system begins to feel threatened, President Putin, I think, asserts a much more lively imperial position. After the protests 5 years ago, we had the expression of this attempt to grab territories in Ukraine, and today with the percolating of protests, I would think that Mr. Putin will be more in the mode of reminding Russians of external enemies and of his role as a defender of the Russian people broadly understood. Then that dynamic will impact Mr. Zelensky's evolution and his behavior as it already is, which is to say that when a businessman named transactional businessman Petro Poroshenko came into power, it was greeted by many people who wanted a quick settlement of all the problems in the East as an opportunity for President Putin to strike a bargain with a more pragmatic rather than an ideological adversary. And over time, President Poroshenko, by circumstances, as a defender of the nation, was forced into adopting, tougher policies. It's just inevitable. It's just what the public expects. It's just what the constitutional duty of a head of state is. And I think President Putin's stance will make out of, I safely predict on this issue, that Volodymyr Zelensky will be more similar in his external policy to Petro Poroshenko than to someone who is going to find a new accommodation with Russia.
Yep, I think so. This gentleman right here, please.
Yes, thank you, Piotr, from the country formerly known as the UK. My question is somewhat similar to that of the foreign policy aspect, but sort of, is this all kind of pointless? Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, Ukraine is quite a pawn state, stuck in the middle of greater geopolitical playground and shenanigans. And as much as we're riding a high from the initial good Ukrainian results, that we might just fall into a bit of a status quo again, because there's little room for the domestic officials to make, unless there is concessions by Russia and agreements from NATO, etc.
What is pointless?
Trying to consider the long-term aspect of what Ukraine can do, because it's stuck. It doesn't have its...
Go ahead, reject the premise of the question.
Each country can develop, and of course Ukraine can develop. It's by far the largest country in Europe, if you don't include Russia. It's a big country with massive resources. Why should it be pointless? I don't understand how one can
because
pose
it
such
doesn't
a
have
question.
its own ability to choose its direction. It's constantly under control by other parties that...
Ukraine is not controlled by Russia. Russia has started a meaningless war in eastern Ukraine, and it has got stuck there. This is a real morass. We know reasonably well about the situation. Occupied Donbass is a hellhole. Half the population, 2.5 million people, have fled. The factories are standing still. It's a serious concern that it's all being poisoned, because you have serious chemical factories that have just been stuck. Russia has got big problems on its hands. It has not incorporated this into Russia. They are not paying Russian salaries and pensions as they do in Crimea. And it's really, if Ukraine can help Russia getting out of the big deep hole that it has got stuck with, and the people who live there are essentially pensioners and criminals, which is not a favored population from an economic point of view. And what does Russia do with that? So it's rather the question. Previously, I would argue that Poroshenko was not really that interested in getting Donbass back. Zelensky, as Ambassador Herbst emphasized here, has shown a much greater interest in getting the whole of Ukraine back together. He emphasizes that in virtually every speech that he makes, that Ukraine goes from Lugansk to Lviv, from Crimea and north. So he has emphasized it much more strongly, and Zelensky is just running in circles around Putin, who looks completely obsolete, as the former Ukrainian leaders look completely obsolete during the election. So while Ukraine had very orderly democratic elections with a perfect democratic transfer of power, we are seeing that on Saturday 1,334 people were detained in Moscow, and a lot of awful police violence was being used, and the authorities simply don't know what to do. It really looks as if they have lost a clue in Moscow. So from these perspectives, Ukraine looks very good. I was in Ukraine a week before the elections, and it looked perfectly fine. If I had any complaint, it was that it was too calm for being an election campaign. I didn't see any campaigning out in the street, a few posters here and there. Otherwise, it was really done on television and in the social media. So Ukraine here really stands out as the post-Soviet state that is really having a sound democratic and civil behavior. This has made an enormous impact in Russia. And I think that we should see the Russian clamp down on the protest in Moscow now very much in this perspective. Ukrainians know how to hold elections. Putin hasn't got a clue.
Thank you. You woke them up. Ambassador Herbst wants to jump in.
I'll express a little bit of sympathy for your question. If you'd asked it in some other think tanks, you might have gotten a much more friendly answer. But here's the thing. The reason I think you asked that question is because people have gotten used to the notion that Russia has the right to tell its neighboring countries what to do. And who are we, 5,000 miles away to say, no, those countries have a right to choose their own future. But if you watch carefully Kremlin policy in Ukraine going back to the Orange Revolution, you'll have seen one mistake after another by the Kremlin, because ultimately the decision makers did not understand something that a previous president of Ukraine, who Putin kind of liked, Leonid Kuchma, said. He said, Ukraine's not Russia. And Putin really thought, and his advisors really thought, that they'd be able to easily take control of eastern Ukraine and call it Novorossiya. And they failed miserably. They failed miserably. And they found that the cost of their operation in Ukraine have been a largely united Ukraine against Kremlin aggression, and a West which, while not sufficiently supportive of Ukraine, far more supportive than Russia ever imagined. And they have put themselves in a box, and a lot of smart people in Moscow understand this. Unfortunately, that number does not yet include the president of Russia. And he does seem to have a great capacity to live in a bubble. Right now reading, I probably should have read it a couple of years ago, Stephen Lee Meyer's excellent biography of Putin. And I just read the section where Putin goes to Grozny in the summer of 2004, Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, which Putin's war on Chechnya had been bombing into a very, very low state of life. And he was stunned by the ravages of war which he had put into place. So his ability to ignore things that are staring him in the face, encouraged by sycophantic advisors, is enormous. But some of those advisors themselves understand that their war in Donbass is a dead end. And their alliance, or would-be alliance with China, designed to give a Bronx cheer to the West, is only putting Russia in a worse position. Because the Chinese are eating the Russians' lunch in Central Asia, while they are focusing on Donbass and Crimea. There are smart people in Moscow who understand that Putin is making a major, major strategic mistake. But he's partly able to do that because he has enablers in the West who accept this 19th and 18th and 17th century conception that Moscow has the right to boss around its neighbors. By the way, the Russian political science elite say that only 5 or 6 countries in the world are truly sovereign. And so when Moscow complains that we don't respect Russia's sovereignty, what they're saying is we don't respect Moscow's right to dictate to its neighbors.
I think there's an ad. No. There's another dead horse that's out there.
Another one?
Another, unfortunately, and that
a small one.
And that it's a big one.
Oh,
that is to say, it's a gigantic horse. That it is Mr. Putin's belief that the Ukrainian state is non-viable. It is his belief that there is no such thing as a Ukrainian people, with the exception of maybe some eccentric Galicians. And that over time, the time and history and destiny are on his side. Now, if you believe that a neighboring state is not a real state, and that a titular nation state has no real titular nation, which is a theme that Mr. Medvedchuk has recently been advancing in Brussels, that there is no Ukrainian nation, that there are just various ethnic groups inside Ukraine, then you have a formula for perpetual efforts to disrupt Ukraine, challenge it, and threaten it, which is another argument in my view that will lead to the solidifying of Zelensky's positions as a very strong defender of the national interest.
Good, great. Okay, I have lots of questions. Where's my microphone? Let's take Jock Mendoza-Wilson, and then we're going to come to the middle.
Hello, Jock Mendoza-Wilson from System Capital Management Group in Kiev. I'd like to ask the panel, how important do they think the appointment and the character of the Prime Minister will be for the importance of the Zelenskyy project? And as a follow-up to that, what are the characteristics that the panel think are going to be needed to drive through the reform project that Zelenskyy firmly believes in?
Go ahead.
Well, I've sort of expressed my views about this already. I do think that he needs a strong, administratively tested, organizationally tested prime minister to run a complex country. If you have a new leader as president, if you have an inexperienced person as the Speaker of the Parliament, I don't know if a country at war with a lot of complex problems can afford someone who has never had, who's getting on-the-job training as prime minister, meaning that has not run a complex institution. It may be true that the proper values and the trust of the president are enough, but I would argue that it would probably be in Ukraine's interest that someone who has run a reasonably complex structure or has functioned within a larger institution, whether it's a larger corporate institution or a larger state or affiliated state institution or quasi-state entity, should hold that kind of a job. There's nobody like that. I mean, the closest person with that kind of experience at the appropriate level in the office of the president currently is Mr. Pristaiko, who is Deputy Foreign Minister and kind of knows how paperwork works, how the structures of a complex bureaucracy work. Most of these other people worked a lot lower down, and of course the people who are outside, the Ivaras and Abramovichus and Alexander Daniluk, again, who are in other positions. But there's nobody currently in the office of the president with that kind of experience. You don't have that kind of if you don't fill that function somewhere in that checklist, it's going to be at least an unprecedented, if not a very challenging, and if not a very big challenge for Ukraine.
Well, what we haven't quite said is that it seems obvious that the prime minister will be a technocrat rather than a politician. And the question here is rather, will it be a strong prime minister who manages the whole cabinet, or will the cabinet really be managed from the president, which is the Putin model? Putin doesn't really use Prime Minister Medvedchuk. He gives order directly to the different ministers. And it appears to me that that is more likely to be the model. But if we get a strong prime minister, for example, Ivaras Abramovichus, or for that matter, Rashkovan or Kobaryev, then I think that the prime minister will have a bigger role. If it will be Alexei Honcharuk, who's much less administrative experience, then I think it will be that the ministers work directly for the presidential office rather than being an independent cabinet of ministers. Regardless of what that will be, I think that we will see that there will be much less differences between the cabinet of ministers and the presidential office than we have seen under other presidents in Ukraine, apart from Yanukovych. Yanukovych and Prime Minister Azarov got along perfectly well, and that is one model, so you can say that the Azarov government functioned better in administrative terms. Admittedly, they stole a lot, but they got things done so that it was relatively fast in comparison with previous Ukrainian government. So one perhaps should look upon that as a model of what it is when there's no disagreement between president and prime minister.
But let's also look at the results too. Okay, let's take a question here, and then these two gentlemen.
Dr. Elena Serrero, Associate Rector of UACU in Kiev, Ukraine. First of all, thank you, Atlantic Council, for presenting this, I think, a very important and well-timed presentation. Also, if we need to call 911, this young man might need it. So, in response to earlier statements by Adrian, and again statements again by Adrian, and then reinforced by Anders and Ambassador Herbst. Adrian, you mentioned first everyone's interest and raised eyebrows at the training session taking place at the resort outside of Lviv. And this is being presented by the second party you had mentioned later on, sort of like, I guess you would call him the last pseudo-oligarch standing, Pinochet. Since he's obviously, we know his history and we know his reputation, how do you see the purpose of this particular, quote, training one-week session for the new parliamentarians? Is this an approach to ingratiate themselves in a different way, since these are not members of the parties that were originally supported by him and other oligarchs?
I think this exercise is useful. I know the people who are putting it together. The Kiev School of Economics is an unengaged and excellent small educational institution which does both training and degree programs, but it does some executive training and administrative training. So I think and it's not so unusual. I mentioned the Gingrich Revolution. Well, the Heritage Foundation, a much more politicized organization, did a training retreat for the new members of the Congress in 1994 when the whole new wave of unexperienced legislators came into office. This is just a much larger group, but I think it's a helpful thing. I hope that this is not a one-off, but that over the course of the year they will have refresher courses and abilities once people take committees to commune with experts in a more rigorous and systematic way. And whoever finances this, I don't think this is, if it's done by the Kiev School of Economics, I don't think there is a way of influencing the message, because the scholars that are affiliated with it and the teachers are above the partisan fray, apart from the fact that they tend to share the economic views of Anders.
Let me just add, of course, this is an excellent thing that has to be done. I was chairman of the board of the Kiev School of Economics for 9 years, and John is on the board right now, and Vakarchuk is on the board of the Kiev School of Economics. It's the best natural institution to do it, so I think that we should just say good for them.
For sure. Okay.
My name is Vadim Gorovich. I'm an independent analyst. You published an article about this short list of candidates for prime minister, and there has been a lot.
Can you speak to the mic?
Okay, there has been quite a bit of kind of backlash in Ukraine about those Naftogaz candidates. So I'm wondering what is the current realistic short list, and why does Zelensky don't take so much time to appoint the prime minister? What do you think are the delay?
I'm going to say that Melinda's next article will be a reflection upon Lao Tzu. Those who know do not say, those who say do not know. We are speculating. There are rumors. There is a fact that there are casting calls or whatever it is with the president. These are, Kiev is not a complete, a cone of silence. Information leaks out. I don't know if any of the people who are parties to this leak, not in my experience, but their friends may leak. And so this is, I would say, informed speculation. But in the end, I think only one person in the end will know what the final decision is, if there is already a final decision. And we just have to wait for a few days.
It looks like the field is very small, and there's quite a lot of information about these candidates. So it's,
Are you asking for our opinion on who should get the job? Zelensky hasn't called me yet. But if you believe the gossip, it sounds like Honcharuk is probably the leading candidate. And I think some of my other board members. So Honcharuk is 35 years old. He's from Chernihiv. He's a lawyer. He's not an economist. So that's one of the interesting things. Zelensky said that he wants an economist and a technocrat. So I'm not sure. I guess lawyer economist is kind of close enough, but Honcharuk is interesting. So he has not worked for an international law firm. He worked for a local law firm for about 8 years. He won a competition after the Maidan to run an office that was in charge of the delivery of basically tearing down red tape and deregulation. And I've done a bunch of snooping on him, and everyone there says he does a good job. He's ambitious, he's young, but he's not run a big team. That's one of my big concerns about him. The biggest team he's run is about 50 or 60. So, if he's selected, he seems to have the right instincts. He seems to know people. People respect him. But one of the questions is of management experience, whether he has the right chops for that. And hopefully he does have good mentors. That was another thing I was encouraged to find out. He does talk to people and he asks for help, which I think is an encouraging sign as well.
I went through, I think before you came in, the four candidates who were interviewed.
Five.
Four who were interviewed at the beginning of Monday, Tuesday last week. Vitrenko was not interviewed.
Okay.
What is your assessment of the situation in Kiev? Zelensky said that Kiev government is pervasively corrupt, and he decided to strip powers away from Klitschko, doing it through Bogdan. And now there are rumors that Tkachenko wants to be the next mayor of Kiev, who is very close associate of Kolomoisky, of course. What is your assessment of the situation?
Okay, thank you so much. Is anyone following Kiev politics? Are you following them?
I think that it would, if the government is of reform inclination, they should continue with the tradition that an elected mayor should be the chief executive and leave it up to the people of Kiev in the next local government elections to select who it is that they choose. If they want to choose someone who's closely affiliated with the president, it'll be their choice. But I think it would be a mistake to try to impose, some kind of external controls, or to try to separate out the elected mayor of any constituency, unless there was a court decision of finding of acts of corruption by an official, and then their removal from office.
Thank you. I have a question here, and then I have a question in the way back. Viola, can you put your hand up so we can bring a mic? Okay, great.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
My name is Mikhail Turgiev. I am a journalist with the Russian news agency RIA Novosti. And my question is, not long ago, President Zelensky offered to discuss Crimea and Donbass issues at a summit in Minsk format, plus President Trump and plus British Prime Minister. I haven't seen much enthusiasm about it in related countries. And my question is, what should be the conditions for such a summit to happen? And what could Zelensky do for it to happen? Thank you.
I would divide your question into two pieces. One is the notion of a high-level diplomatic event involving not just the Minsk group, but also the United States and Great Britain. And in fact, I think that the leadership in Ukraine has wanted, certainly at least the United States, to be added to the Minsk group for some years. So that's not surprising. While I think that would be a good thing, I'm not sure it's necessary, because we all know the Minsk group has achieved nothing, except it's been important because it's been the vehicle by which sanctions have been maintained by the European Union, and that's a good thing. And we know that the only serious negotiations regarding the war, the Kremlin war in Donbass, has been between the United States and Russia in the Surkov channel, first with Toria Nuland, and then now with Kurt Volker. So that's point one. Point two, if you're talking about a summit involving presidents and prime ministers, that would have to be put together very, very carefully, because one does not want a summit without at least some chance of success. But that's just sort of standard diplomatic practice.
Great. Okay. Viola?
Viola Ginger from Just Security at NYU Law. What is your sense of how much influence that Ukraine's civil society had on the election, in both for the presidential election and the parliamentary elections, and what degree of influence will they have, and will it be superseded by any other considerations?
It's an interesting and complicated question. In my view, engaged civil society cleared the path for a outsider president, but they were hoping it would come from civil society. It came completely out of left field, and I think civil society and a lot of sort of the professional activists in Ukraine are kind of embittered by this. They feel it was their turn at the helm, and they're not going to be participating, which also means that there is a very talented group of critically inclined people who will not be giving a large margin of error for the new president. And so that the sniping that came very early in the Poroshenko administration will start coming from critical media. It already is. And we can say vigilance with media is a good thing, but I always believe that you need to give a president some space to kind of show himself and some time to achieve certain things rather than starting from the beginning. But one of those, I spoke with a very important, influential journalist of a critical journalist recently, and she referred to this as a profanity that of who is in power. And with that kind of attitude, I think he's going to have a tough road to hoe. So organized civil society is mildly present in Servant of the People. It is many of the representatives of civil society that went in and became the Euro-optimists and so on. There is a far lesser representation. There are some in the Poroshenko faction and mainly in Holos. Those are the two places where civic activists entered into the current parliament. But I think civil society in Kiev, at least, the think tanks and the activists and so on, in the main, were a little bit shocked by the result that they had created. But I think they helped create the environment that opened the door for Mr. Zelenskyy, but they didn't enter in through that door with him. And so I think he will have an opportunity and a challenge both to engage them or co-opt them or to be challenged by them in the coming months and years.
Anders.
Yeah, I would draw that even a bit further. A large number of civil society organizations came out immediately after the presidential elections with red lines for President Zelenskyy. And you can say that Poroshenko easily would have crossed half of those red lines. So it was an outright hostility to the new president. He is not ours. He didn't ask us for permission. He got elected without us. What is this? So I was quite surprised to see that President Poroshenko got so much support from so many civil society activists. And I don't want really to try to explain why it happened. I can see a couple of factors, which I don't want to name, that led them in this direction. Neither of them very complimentary for those activists. As Melinda pointed out, the Euro-optimists, I think that there are two who were elected, one on the fatherland list and one in the European Solidarity group, and they simply blew it. They were in 5 different parties last time around. They did not set up a party as both Zelenskyy and Vakarchuk did, which is what they should have done. They wanted instead to sail on somebody else's ship, and that didn't work. And therefore they are very much squeezed out. I think that we all regret several of these people that they are not there now, that several are good friends of ours. But politics is politics. You have to be serious about it, otherwise you won't win.
I have a slightly different take than Adrian, and I spent a lot of time talking to civil society. So what Adrian said is absolutely true, that civil society is extremely talented. Many of them are sort of politicians in waiting, and they're waiting for a moment. They keep telling me they're waiting for a moment when there's enough of them that they can change things. And a lot of them have decided that there aren't enough of them yet to go into politics, so they think their talent is better spent as watchdogs. However, there are some powerful watchdogs that have gone into the new government. I can name several of them. Most of them are on the Holos list. The former head of Transparency International Ukraine is very high on the list. There's 2 members from the Kiev City Council who are outstanding attorneys. They're both part of Holos. There's a woman who used to run the best NGO that was looking at health reform. There's 2 members of the Anti-Corruption Action Committee that are both in Parliament. There are some really tough activists in Parliament. So it's a mix. Many of them, Adrian is right, are still outside, but there are some very tough activists who have gone into government as well. So let's take Rich Kramer and then the gentleman behind him, and then I think we have to wrap up.
Thank you, Melinda. Richard Kramer, U.S.-Europe Alliance. This is a question primarily for Dr. Osland. Going back to the beginning of today's discussion, focused on the need to oust a number of law enforcement officials in the numbers of several thousand. And I'm interested, if you had the opportunity to advise the government of Ukraine on the matter, how would you suggest that they incentivize that so that those predominantly men leaving those positions would not then in turn occupy spaces that would otherwise destabilize Ukraine via criminal or activities sponsored by foreign governments? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. So if we take care, 8,000 SBU officers and 18,000 prosecutors should be sacked. If you look upon what a prosecutor today is in Ukraine, it's a person who has state authority to indulge in private blackmail. The prosecutors do proper investigations. Then they go to the person in question and say, I have very interesting materials about you. What are you prepared to pay? So essentially these people should be put in prison. So the straightforward answer is that these people should be put into prison for what they have done. If they are not going to join organized crime. That should be the answer. Practically, that's not possible. What we have seen is it's only 3 post-communist countries that have been successful in judicial reforms. East Germany, Estonia, and Georgia. What all these 3 countries did is that they sacked everybody from the top. In prosecution, which is relatively few people, and in the courts. There are 8,000 judges in Ukraine. In Ukraine now, 44 of the new Supreme Court judges did not pass the integrity test. And it's about a quarter of the total. We have very many Supreme Court judges in Ukraine. So this needs to be redone somehow. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say how. But if you have one rotten apple in a basket, then all the apples rot. And I think this is what we should expect if this is not cleared out. The court reforms and the prosecution reforms have been the worst reforms in most post-communist countries. So we know how not to do it. And we have 3 good cases where it has worked. So these are the patterns. But what you point to is a serious problem. And we will have to expect that people who have been criminals under state protection, they will then continue to be criminals without state protection.
Great, thank you. He is a lawyer, so maybe in your free time you can write a plan on how to fix the judiciary system. This is our last question. Go ahead, please.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. As an American, I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of a democratic election anywhere on the planet. So was there no effort, no Russian effort to influence this, cyber or social media, or was it inept, like maybe too many obscure references to Hillary's emails?
There were substantial, I would say, almost traditional Kremlin efforts to influence Ukraine's elections through massive disinformation, through cyber attacks generally, but also particularly on the Central Election Commission, through the, I would say, the ham-handed visit to Moscow of the opposition bloc for Life Party in March before the presidential election, for pictures with Medvedev, where you had Boyko, the head of the opposition bloc, looking very uncomfortable. But it wasn't successful. I mean, again, nothing has solidified a sense of Ukraine as a nation and Ukrainian nationalism as Kremlin aggression going back to the spring, the late winter of 2013-14, and then the spring of 2014, the seizure of Crimea and the war in Donbass. Those of us who followed Ukraine for decades saw that immediately. All the Ukrainian flags in Kiev when I went back to Ukraine in June of 2014. I called on President Kuchma at that time, and he said to me, you know, I had a grandson who never quite identified as Ukrainian until the Russians marched into Crimea. Simple fact.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Could you put your hands together and help me thank our wonderful panelists?